Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. This is the CRKT Nirk Tighe. Very, very cool blade. It's a Brian Tighe design with a Glenn Klecker lock that kind of inspired Brian to come up with this blade. And the custom model, the custom version from Brian Tighe, who's one of my favorite designers, a Canadian by the way, lives in St. Catharines, won the Innovative Blade of the Year at Blade Show 2010, at which point CRKT picked up the knife and made it a production model for them. It's still in production for them, and you can get this model, which is the normal Nirk Tighe, or there's a mini Nirk Tighe as well. As you know, I definitely prefer larger size blades, and so there's no way I was going to get the mini, but maybe if you like this but feel like it's a little too big, that would be more in keeping with your preferences. There's no way, this knife is too cool to ever be reduced in size. The large size, I think, helps to appreciate the design of it, but that's okay. If you prefer the mini, I won't hold it against you. Now, the size and weight on this blade, it's definitely, I think, a large folding knife, or a large medium folder. It's not like an extra large Espada or anything like that. It's 9 inches overall, almost a 4-inch blade, 3 7/8, and the handle is only 3/8 of an inch thick. Now that puts me in mind of another blade that you may be familiar with, the Cold Steel Code 4. It's a large knife with a fairly thin profile and a reasonably lightweight. This knife weighs only 4.7 ounces, which makes it very easy to carry. That slim design with a lightweight means you can carry this knife and not notice it as much smaller blades that don't have the nearly 4-inch handle, that don't have the overall size. But because this is so thin and so light, it actually carries better than some blades that are a lot smaller. So the blade itself, I guess that's where we'll start since it's at the top of the blade, the way I'm holding it here now. The blade is 3 7/8 inches of Aus-8 steel. It's a drop point design with a recurve and hollow grind. You can see it's a partial hollow grind. There's a swedge here at the top. Very, very cool blade. Fits the overall look and feel of this knife very, very well. And those cutouts, certainly they serve as deployment holes if you want to take this knife out slowly rather than flip it out. But they also serve, according to CRKT, to lighten up the knife a little and balance it better. Sometimes with a very light handled knife, it can feel very front heavy because you've got this big piece of steel in a very light handle. In this case, the balance is actually quite good, and CRKT attributes that to those cutouts in the blade. And so very, very nice blade, very functional. It is a flipper design, and so there's the back of the flipper. You can see it's a little different than a lot of knives, a lot of flipping knives that you see. This almost looks like a kind of a horn coming out the back. It does have to be flipped with a bit of authority because of the way this locking mechanism works. It's constantly applying a little bit of pressure to the blade tang. So there's no point at which it's totally released. It's rubbing, kind of all the way until it closes, and rubbing all the way until lockup. Because of that little bit of friction, it's not a lot, it's not serious, but you do have to flip it with just a little bit of authority, and you get used to that right away, as compared to, let's say, the CRKT Fossil or the Ripple or something like that. They just kind of slip out really, really nicely. There's just a little bit of friction here. It's not the end of the world, and it's kind of necessary for this knife design, so I'm not going to complain about it at all, but you just need to know you have to flip it with a little bit of authority. The handle is all stainless steel, and the way this handle is put together is that they press out the two parts of the handle, then they make these cutouts after the fact and blue anodize the whole thing, so it all gets blue anodized. But then they do this polish, satin polish on everything, so that the exposed surfaces, the surfaces that you touch with a flat edge as you were sanding or polishing, the blue gets removed, and only in those recesses and on the inside of the frame is the blue left behind. If you take this knife apart, the whole inside of the frame is blue. By the way, I'll talk about the pivot. It is not a Torx bit. It's just a regular Allen key construction, which is nice. But if you take this knife apart, which I have, you need to know that there are ball bearings in here which are not retained in the blade in any way. So you take that apart, those balls are going to fall out. They're going to go everywhere unless you're working in a cookie tray, or I did it over a paper towel in a cookie tray so that the paper towel would they're not going to roll around that much. And then I cleaned it all up. The deployment wasn't ideal when I first got this knife. I cleaned it up, and now it's very smooth and very nice. And you'll find that a lot of knives, if a knife that 1 is used, 2 has been sitting in a warehouse for a long time, 3 has taken a long time to get here, let's say you ordered it from China or something like that, or has factory dirt in it, all those things can cause the action on a knife to be less than ideal. And so it doesn't hurt to just take a knife apart, clean everything up around that pivot area, and then put it back together. And every knife I've done that to. I've got a couple that I still need to, that the deployment is only so-so. And so I need to take them apart, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. I've found a real benefit in doing that with all of my blades. The rest of the handle, let's talk about that. It does have these cutouts, which of course are largely aesthetic, except for the 2 long cuts that I'm going to flip this around and hold the blade so you can see well. This cut that starts here and goes down and across all the way over here, notice it almost separates the handle into 2 halves, just attached down here. Another long cut starts here and goes up. Now those 2 cuts are what become the locking mechanism. If I push on the back of that top half of the blade, you can see the lock disengages and I can close the knife. That is the design that was devised by Glenn Klecker, and it's called the Nirk lock. What it stands for is Nathan, which is his son's name, irreducibly complex knife. That's what Nirk stands for. And the reason he calls it irreducibly complex is because this is the simplest method of locking knife that he came up with. And it's a pretty cool design. This long cut and this cut basically serve to make that whole part of the handle pivot and unlock the knife. And so it's irreducibly complex. That is, it's boiled down to the least number of parts possible. And on the Nirk knife, which is another CRKT knife, really they're only the handle is one piece, the blade, and then you've got the pivot screw with some washers. So it's an extremely simple knife. And that's what Glenn Klecker, the designer, was going for. And I think he did a great job. Really, really creative locking mechanism on this blade. And although it looks, because of the cutouts and because of the design that Brian Tighe has put into this knife, it looks really complex, like there's a lot going on, but in fact it's an incredibly simple, straightforward design. Totally genius. You got to give Glenn Klecker a lot of credit for coming up with that, what is truly a new way of locking up a knife. So cool. Very, very impressive. So that's how the locking mechanism works, and it's really, really a neat locking mechanism. There is a lanyard hole here, and it is a tip-up carry, so the lanyard hole would work, but I don't know. I think if you put a lanyard on this, it kind of would diminish the overall look and feel of that blade. It's such a cool knife that I would be afraid to take away from the design that Brian Tighe, I feel like, has perfected here. And so I definitely am not going to be putting a lanyard on this. Maybe you would. You could put a black one or a blue one on, and it may not make that big of a difference. Single position pocket clip, and it's a pretty low ride pocket clip, which is nice. You can see in your pocket your jeans are going to end about there, so only that much of the knife is going to be showing. Again, this knife carries very well. I know I've said that before. I'll say it again now. Very, very nice to carry. Even though it's a very large knife, and I've said this before in my videos, I love it when I can carry a big knife without having my pocket weighed down. I mean, it's light, it's simple, just a great everyday carry knife, totally comfortable. Not to mention, as an everyday carry knife, every time that you take this knife out to use it, people are going to be like, whoa, what is that? That is so cool. And so we've moved now from the blade and the handle and the pivot and stuff, specific areas, into an overall impression. And this is just a cool knife. And all of Brian Tighe's knives, I've got to say, I'm in love with every single one of them. They are totally awesome. Definitely my favorite knife designer. I love the fact that I can get a bunch of his design from CRKT, and I love the fact that he's Canadian. I'm just a cool guy. So where would I see this knife fitting in? Definitely as an EDC blade. I wouldn't call this a hard use folder. There's a little bit of flex in the handle that I think if you put it under extreme conditions, that flex may hurt the performance of this knife. I've used it pretty hard, and I will say one of the cool things about this lock is that the more you squeeze it, the tighter the locking mechanism becomes. So I'm not concerned about it closing on me or anything like that. I'm more concerned that if you really push this knife hard, you may bend or twist this handle. And remember, the locking mechanism is integrally part of the handle, meaning there's only, here's the only point of connection. Let's flip it over here. Here's the only point of connection between the front of the blade and the back of the blade. So you can see that it is all stainless steel. It hasn't been a problem for me at all, and I've cut pretty hard with this knife. But I just don't feel like I would want to put it through a very, very rigorous, hard use cutting test. I'm not going to chop a tree down with it or anything like that. You probably could. You'd probably be fine, but I'm not going to put it under that stress because this, as far as I'm concerned, for me, is going to be a collector knife. I'm still going to carry it, but I want it to be a part of my collection. Therefore, I want it to look good and not get damaged. Love this knife. Gotta say, I highly recommend it. If you like the way this knife looks and feels, it's not terribly expensive. It's super easy to carry. It's just everything about this knife is awesome. Performance, blade steel, weight, comfort, cutting ability, just on and on we could go with how really cool this knife is. And in addition to all those other sort of technical factors, you've got a really cool looking blade. I mean, you've got a knife that is a custom designed knife that is just carried over by CRKT into a production model, which I think is totally awesome. So that is the CRKT Nirk Tighe. One of my favorite knives, certainly one of my favorite CRKT knives, although I've got to say I'm pretty well equally impressed with all of the CRKT knives that have been done by Brian Tighe. So there you go. That's the Nirk Tighe. I hope I let you look at the knife enough. I try to pay more attention to that as I'm making these videos. There's a really good close-up of the blade and the handle. That's how it fits in hand. You can see there's a good portion of both the pommel and the bolster sticking out. So you can see it's a large handle, it's a large knife. Gotta say, I'm really, really impressed with the Nirk Tighe from CRKT.